Hi, I'm Janis.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. Today we're going to dive into the deepening signals we're each tracking as we head into 2025 and look more deeply into the event horizon after which this podcast is named, because here we are. We're going to take an especially close look at the provocative consciousness-related elements like telepathy and shared consciousness that we're noting and talking about. So we're going to start out by talking about this first question. What signals do we track and what are we noticing?
Well, the first thing I think we probably both want to get into is something that's really in the news right now, especially in our circles within ufology, and that's these quote-unquote drone incursions. So interestingly, there are numerous elements we've been tracking over the course of this podcast and over the course of our conversations, and each of those has seemingly deepened or become more intense, and we'll touch on some of those. But one of the fascinating aspects of being alive and seeing things unfold is sometimes things you're not expecting come into the picture too. And that's the case with these, again, quote unquote, drone incursions. So the first thing I'll say about this is how, even the way I put that in quotes right there is because this is really unclear about what these are exactly. And there are many, many theories being bandied about within ufology as to what might explain these kinds of drone incursions. On the one hand, I know I've discussed it on other podcasts that to some degree, drone has become this ubiquitous term that is used to basically describe anything that is not a typical plane or helicopter. So it's become a convenient way that the DoD and whatnot, the defense contractors, can refer to unidentified phenomena, but use a term that sounds quite boring and prosaic. So the average person in the population isn't necessarily going to pay attention when they hear about drone incursions or drone swarms. But of course, you and I both know, Janis, that part of the data coming out is that some of the activity, some of the characteristics of flight of these objects is sometimes anomalous. Other times not so anomalous, but they do other things that are strange and sometimes even do things that seem absurd. So before I dive into the various hypotheses, what's your initial take when you reflect on how much this is happening? Because this is not just an issue of one or two jumping up in one location. There are numerous ones day after day after day for weeks, and it's international on top of that. So what do you make of the whole thing?
Yeah, thanks. I think about it in bulk. So, we had the Langley Air Force drone issue, what was it, 2023, December or something around that time. And then it was kind of quiet. And then we started to see them popping up again in the UK over the three big bases there on November 20th. Right, apparently, as right before the U.S. was going to be sending ICBM missiles there. So the idea that it was linked to the geopolitical tension that's clearly happening in Europe is present, except that it's gotten really strange. So between 11/20 and now, it's popping up everywhere. I mean, anybody in the United States is very aware that New Jersey right now is a massive hotspot, but it's also in Texas and Costa Rica and Louisiana and Canada, and I saw something from Sudan the other day, Argentina, I believe, Germany. It seems to be prolific, even in China too. And I say it that way because the possibility that these are advanced Chinese tech is one of the theories that I know you'll probably touch on here. I kind of wonder if one of the primary reasons for it is and one of the things I know you're going to touch on is just to have us question what's going on. I'm going to just, say I'm landing and I don't think this is all human tech. It makes no sense to me. There's way too many staying up for way too long with way too many anomalous features with no clear entry and exit point. And it's not just the military. They're tracking everything now. We've got lots and lots of eyes on this because everybody, so many people are in the know, the public's in the know, and we have a lot of advanced technology now that even average people can be using to be tracking where they're coming from and going to. So there's just too many pieces to this that seem profoundly anomalous to make me believe that there will be an utterly prosaic explanation. And if there is, we should be very, very worried. That's what I think, because it probably is the beginning of a war. I have more to say about the military response, but I want to bounce to you first for you to float your theories.
Right, so I'll pick up on what you just left off there with, and that's the first idea here. And this is why, regardless of what this is potentially quite problematic and daunting, because one of the theories being floated that explains some of the data, because again, quoting John Keel here, I think it's important that when we develop theories, they have to try to make sense of all the data, not just some of it. And we have to be careful not to just want to pay attention to some data that's more interesting to us. Because one of the questions that comes up is, why has the US not shot these things down or captured them? If they're just drone technology, this is something that people can use in a hobby club. Why does the US military not have the capacity to take these things down? We remember what happened when Iran launched a drone strike against Israel and how successful Israel was using some of their own tech and some of ours to shoot down pretty much 99% of those. So why is it that over secure, really important defense installations, nuclear installations, both in the UK and the US, as well as elsewhere, we would not be taking these things down? And you would think that the US military, if they were doing that, they would want to make that clear in a public relations kind of announcement. Yes, we don't take lightly to these things coming into our secure facilities. We've taken them down, we've captured them, and we will continue to do that. But that's not what's happened. And so that raises questions. Number one, is it possible that they can't take them down? And if that's the case, that would suggest they're not prosaic. The other possibility that I've heard floated amongst many possibilities is that the reason they're not taking them down is because they know darn well where they're coming from, and that it would be Russia, or in this case, I've heard even more likely China in this case, if it's a sociopolitical issue. And the reason why the U.S. doesn't want to admit that's what they are or take them down is because we're at this knife edge here right now between now and World War III, the beginning of World War III, like you pointed to, and that perhaps behind the scenes, things are so tense that the U.S. basically knows that according to international law, that this would be considered an act of war. And that just exacerbates things quickly. We could quickly find ourselves in a nuclear kind of exchange. So that's one of the other possibilities in terms of the military and why they might be responding the way they are. We obviously hear sometimes they'll try to claim it's just traditional drones. Other spokespeople will say it's sometimes showing characteristics that show anomalous flight characteristics. I want to hear your take on both the international sociopolitical kind of possibility as well as more UAP kind of possibility.
All right, let's take each one at a time. I mean, obviously I'm not a strategist. I have no idea how the military really thinks about these things, but there are some things I've noticed. For example, it's just not like the US. It's not like any robust muscular military to just allow massive amounts of incursions over very sensitive, not just military installations, but infrastructure, US infrastructure. And to just allow that with impunity and to say nothing and signal nothing. And by signaling, I mean, I'm watching, like I'm sure a lot of other people are, the military response to questions, like the DoD response to press questions about it, because it started to come up. And the other day there was a questioner, and the DoD response was crazy. I mean, to me, I was like, really? Okay, we're studying it. We're calling in experts, and what was most notable is they said that we don't believe these pose any threat. I'm like, how the hell would you know that at this point? But mostly what I noticed is the words, we are, what did they say? Something, a competent, comprehensive, and holistic approach. Well, I'm thinking to myself, these are not the words that you use if you want to signal to a potential adversary that we've got our eyes on you and we will deal with you, right? Those are just way too soft and squishy words. They're not military speak in my mind. So even if the military knew who this was and didn't want us to know, but they're aware that all of the press is being monitored by their adversaries. They would use that to signal, in my thinking, we are aware of what's going on and we're going to deal with you. And that, I didn't get that at all. And it's hard not to miss, the repeated, you've seen this at the local and the more national response levels, the repeated appraisals that these don't pose a threat. So that doesn't make sense either. I can imagine, again, a scenario in which the military knows what they are, knows they're an adversary, knows it could be problematic. I don't think they'd be assuring everybody that there's no risk. I think they'd be saying, we're investigating and we'll have an answer for you. And they'd be behind the scenes figuring out what the heck they're going to do. But it's going to be a robust response because it's basically an invasion of your homeland, of the most muscular military on the planet. So that just, I don't know. I can't quite wrap my brain around the way that feels to me as an outsider. And then the UAP thing, I think it makes more sense there. Frankly, all of the signals do just make a lot more sense. Could it be, though, that there is a mix of actual UAP activity and some sort of communication that's happening? And that would be an interesting place to go. What would the communication be? If in fact this is UAP, why so much? Why now? Why so visible? And there could be adversarial mix-in. Like, it's a great time if you really want to target the U.S., especially, although we know it's not just the U.S. and allies. It's a good time to mix in your own drones or nefarious activity because we're pretty vulnerable, We've in a lot of ways, we're in the middle of a crossover in terms of leadership in this country, as well as with these incursions and all of the obfuscation and confusion around that. It would be a good time to send in real adversary. So maybe some of it is UAP and some of it is adversarial. I don't know. I think one thing I do know, and I really want to hear you talk about what you think the communication would be, is it does seem to have our attention. Certainly not everybody, but a lot of us who don't normally pay attention, and I'm noticing that in my network, are paying attention, and they're going, what is going on?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another sort of nuance possibility that kind of combines the two, right? And that is the possibility that these might be reverse engineered craft that are being used by adversaries. And this would be a ramping up of things and, again, could signal the potential for World War III. Because one of the notions I've heard bandied about before is that some of this tech has been around for a while, it has been successfully reverse engineered. And if that's the case here in the US, it's probably likely the case in China and Russia as well. But they would strategically perhaps hold off from using those particular vehicles until it was really, really necessary because they don't want to tip their hand that they have these things. So that's been one of the arguments I've heard made. And if we are approaching World War III or the potential of it, then perhaps now the time is that they would actually use those. But to your point, it's not just in the US and the UK that this has been noticed. You mentioned several places in the US and other parts of the world. I've heard that these are being cited in India, Pakistan, France, Britain, as we said, and China. And it's not just, as you said, it's not just over nuclear weapons facilities, but over nuclear facilities that are actual plants that are actually generating nuclear power. Now, when you talk about sensitive infrastructure, think about 3 Mile Island, think about Chernobyl, right? Some of these objects could carry a payload, drop something on a nuclear facility, not even a nuclear weapons facility, and cause a meltdown in a place like New Jersey, which is up in the heavily densely populated northeast of our country. It could be catastrophic. So again, the notion that the U.S. would just let this happen and say it doesn't seem to be posing a threat because they're not sending nasty messages or something seems kind of preposterous. Now, I think to draw further clarity for people about why this is so perplexing and why one particular hypothesis doesn't really necessarily stand out as answering for all the data, I want to describe some of the things that people are noticing, just for those who've not been tracking this. So one person on social media, Klaus, said this from what he was seeing where he lives. He said, I still don't think people are grasping how many of these things there are. We're at the highest point in the area and our bedroom window overlooks their flight path. We might not see them close up, but we see them all. It's nuts. Easily seen 100 drones by now. What the hell is happening? Right, is what he said. We saw some orange orbs over the tree line last winter and just saw another one a few minutes ago. It grew in size and then disappeared as soon as we started filming. Right, so this is something else that happens. Notions of these things disappearing. For instance, I heard someone else point out that apparently Black Hawk helicopters have tried to intercept these drones in New Jersey, but they quote-unquote go dark and disappear. Now, whether that means they can't track them because they're no longer using lights or they literally are dematerializing is not clear. But again, this is part of the ambiguity here. So let's mention another interesting case here. People have talked about plasma-like material or behavior for some of these objects. Then we also have this case of it interfering with people's electronics. So, quote, one family in Morris County who followed a drone in their car said that as the drone hovered over them, their car's clock changed time and only returned to normal as they drove off. So once again, there we have a case where it's interfering with electronic instruments, which happens both in the presence of UAP, but also for contactees or abductees who've come back from contact and suddenly find that just being close to electronics messes with electronics because of something that's changed in them. And in this case, too, we have the possibility at least of, if not missing time, then temporal anomalies basically happening around these objects. And then finally, I want to point out something that Ross Coulthart reported on yesterday, I think it was. Witnesses in New Jersey told me that what looked like a 737 was flying over someone's house only about 150 to 200 feet over their house. Now, in that case, in a normal 737, the noise would be deafening if it's only 150 feet up. But apparently there was no sound whatsoever. So you and I both know, and we talked about this previously, and I sent you a link to some of this that has happened historically. This is part of the quote-unquote phenomenon, that sometimes they will mimic human vehicles. So in this case, a 737 sounds a lot like that, but clearly it's not just a 737, which raises further questions around even these things that look more like prosaic drones might actually be mimicry on behalf of UAP or NHI to make them look that way. And the last thing I want to say before I turn it back to you for some additional thoughts is that to the point we began with, the ambiguity itself might be the end goal here, because what it does is it makes us ask questions. It opens our minds. And where we have these kind of not so healthy habits to quickly attach to things and clamp down on our narratives and not think outside the box, this forces us to, because of the ambiguity of the narrative and the details and the data. So in that sense, it's kind of like a mass collective Zen koan, in that it is meant to stop your brain from following its usual trajectory and open up new possibilities, or even hold that posture of saying, I don't know what else could be happening here, since none of these hypotheses seem to fit all of the data completely.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been pondering this question that I posed, and I'd love to hear what you think about it too. I mean, let's just assume for a minute this is a UAP, actual, or a subset of this is actual UAP. Well, then what would the communication be? So one possibility is what you just said. It's just sort of the wow factor, right? Just grab our attention and get us asking questions. But the other could be track more closely to actual world events, to the extent, to the degree that it does kind of look like we might potentially be on the brink of a war that most of us are not tracking. I say that for a variety of reasons, not just because of this. I mean, we all know the geopolitical situation is pretty tense. There's been a lot of motion that has been quiet, but present if you're looking for it. And I personally know, I mean, I was on the phone with a colleague who lives in Belgium a few weeks ago, just like not even that long ago. It's like 2.5 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, who told us, I and another colleague, and now mine, she's not into this at all. I mean, this isn't my world I have with her. And she said that the Belgian government had just told all of its citizens that they should be prepared to have 3 months of supplies on hand in case something happened, like an extended grid going down sort of event, potentially. And I know that a friend of mine from Finland, said they got the same communication. I'm not sure if that's happening for all European countries. It'd be an interesting question, but they're clearly preparing for the potential of something. So what if, we are on one of those event horizon moments that really do signal the potential for intervention, or at least this, hello from the universe, humans. You should be very, very, very mindful of where you go from here, because extinction might be the next stop. And it's, close. That's a possibility. And then the other factor that's very physical would be just the degree to which it's looking like we're, on a line for more, we're online for more extensive earth changes coming up. I mean, we know we have lots of data to suggest we are not in a good place that way. It's only going to get worse. And I don't know if you were here in the United States and you were anywhere near the West Coast, it was obvious, there was a massive tsunami warning just the other day off the coast of San Francisco. And astrologically speaking, which we can get to in a minute if you want, it's looking like there's probably going to be a lot of big Earth-related events in the near-term future, especially as we go into 2025.
Yeah, let me just say one more thing about this drone incursion thing before we shift to some of that. Because, this does kind of dovetail with some other elements we follow. I would love to get your take on the astrological perspective. But one other possibility that's been floated that relates to the shootdowns that happened in 2023 is that there are factions within the deep state, if you will, within the rogue community that has been part of the reverse engineering program, who actually now are quite bullish about wanting disclosure to happen. They A certain percentage of them are persuaded that it needs to happen. It's in the best interest of humanity for it to happen. And if it's not happening through the usual means, through congressional oversight and those kinds of things, then they are going to stir the pot by deliberately flying some of these reverse engineered vehicles. So that raises a third possibility, right? That it's not necessarily an adversarial nation, nor is it U.S. tech per se, but it might be part of this rogue group that initially began with the U.S. military, that is now perhaps broken off, acting independently to some degree, and is brazenly and increasingly brazenly demonstrating this technology over populated areas to force the conversation, ultimately to force disclosure. So that's something else to keep in the mix. Something I think overall that we want to be aware of is that, again, we should resist the tendency to want to lock down on one possibility if the data isn't pointing squarely in that direction. That's one thing I would add to people as well.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really, really important, and I want to circle back around that really quickly. But I will say that the deep state faction concept is one that makes a lot of sense, and it's something that I know multiple people have pointed to as a possibility. But I gotta say that mm, just the sheer number, the sheer volume, and the sheer spread, my mind just keeps going like, how much would that cost to put that much tech up in the air night after night after night? Seemingly disappearing, appearing and disappearing in a way that's almost nobody can track. The amount of money that would cost all over the world is astronomical in my mind. So I don't know, not to say that it can't happen, but I think the other thing that I was thinking when you were talking about, as this started, I started to think about Stephen Greer's press conference in 2023. And there was a point in which, I mean, no matter what you think of Stephen Greer, one of the things that he has historically not done is to give a lot of time information. He doesn't usually talk in terms of, we have X amount of time or not. But in that press conference, I remember him saying that there was a particular time constraint and disclosure needed to happen within 2024. And he got pressed by one of the press people that were there around that, and he was kind of uncomfortable, it seemed to me, being pushed too much on that. But I logged it away as a little puzzle piece, and then it came back up again when Lou, most recently, Lou Elizondo, as many of you know, also suggested that there was some time element at play, but he was not at liberty to talk about what that was or when it was. And as we all know, if you follow the UAP world, there's been a lot of talk around what's going to happen between 25 and 27, especially 27. I think that's been the big focus. Bledsoe talks about 2026, but the sense that we are coming upon, an actual event horizon. We're in it now. We're not approaching it. We're in it. And that there is something else on the other side of this that some people are aware of an unknown nature to the rest of us, that may be a factor here is certainly a puzzle piece on my board. The only other thing I want to say, okay, really quickly about this is that I think where you landed is the most important part, which is we don't know. We're not going to know. I think we all need to be collecting data, basically watching, watch what pieces. Let's work together to put the puzzle pieces together. And let's assume that we're probably not going to know until later. But in the meantime, I think that the large question that I know you and I always come back to is, well, how do we meet this moment as humans, individually and collectively? What does it mean for how we live our lives right now, especially as we're approaching Christmas and things like that? I've been thinking about, do I make sure that everybody in my life has, that I tell them all, please be sure you have stuff on hand just in case. Just stay light on your foot. Make sure you do your practices, all that kind of stuff. I think for me that becomes the most important question, because there's just so much we're not going to know, I think, for quite a while.
Right. And one last piece I want to add in terms of another theory that's being thrown about before you kind of maybe give the astrological perspective that relates to all this is that, and you kind of hinted at it, or you made me think about it when you brought up Stephen Greer, because this is the false flag kind of notion that the military itself is basically going to stage what looks like an alien invasion so that they can take control, so they can garner even more funds from different countries, so that they can bolster their own resources. I think that's actually a pretty weak argument, and I don't look at the situation right now and how the U.S. government and the U.S. military is pitching this. It doesn't sound like that to me. It doesn't sound like a consensus has been drawn and they're trying to really control the narrative and develop that as the predominant narrative. I don't pick that up at all. If anything, they're buying time. Like you said, they're using interesting words to describe how they're trying to address this and make sense of it, which tells me there's true anomalies that they're trying to make sense of as well. At the same time, they don't want to cause panic, so they're trying to not sound alarmed when they talk about it. But again, there's still the overarching question of, is this NHI ramping things up? Is it a possible rogue element of the military that's trying to push disclosure with this? Or is it an adversarial nation perhaps using reverse engineered tech, and this is being kept quiet because it basically is the prelude to World War III? And is it some combination of all those things, as well as things we haven't even thought of? So yes, we both land on not landing, that we want to keep open minds, stay curious, keep the fascination piece going, not get swamped with fear, not let that be our response, because as famously is said in Dune, fear is the mind killer. We want to expand into this moment, not retract. And on that note, why don't you give us, Janis, because I know you track this and you helped me become more familiar with this, the astrological perspective on what has happened and what's coming.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to. I do track this, and for scientists out there, they might be rolling their eyes at this moment, but I will tell you, I really firmly believe that at some point we will understand the science behind this. I think there is a science, and it's profoundly accurate, especially at the evolutionary perspective, like when we're looking at the big picture collective perspective. These days, if I meet somebody important in my life, I always look at their astrology because there's just so much you can see. I can look at my own and see how much is there, and it's fascinating. But we as a collective have some massive changes upcoming. Some we've already entered, and they will really flavor the epoch, because some of the big planets, the planets of the outermost planets that move very slowly around the sun and through the houses, the various astrological houses, are changing sign over the next 18 months. And the fact that we have three major planets, we've got Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, all changing sign within an 18-month window of each other, is extraordinarily rare. It just doesn't happen very often. So the one that probably most people have heard about is Pluto going into Aquarius. When Pluto went into Capricorn, Capricorn is the sign of big structures, government, the institutions, the edifices that most of us got born thinking were here a million years ago and will be here for another million years. The justice system, our educational systems, our financial systems, those kinds of things. When it moved into, that's Capricorn. When Pluto, the planet of regeneration, it's the one that just tears everything down so that it can be rebirthed. It moved in there in 2007. We had a massive financial crash, and that began the beginning of this passage, because it stays in a house up, can be up to 20 years of just complete terraforming of our institutions, including democracy itself, which we all know. So it just moved it's been kind of going a little bit over this node, but it just moved into Aquarius November 19th. And that signals a shift. Aquarius is all about all the things that we like to talk about on this podcast: the cosmos, technology, networks, humanity, humanitarian causes. I will say, for those of you who, like the kingly structure, it is not favorable to kingly structures. That's one of the reasons I'm not so worried about a democracy, frankly, personally. It just doesn't favor those setups. And it especially doesn't favor it when you think about Saturn going into Aries and Jupiter going to Gemini. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that means, and I'm not an astrologer, an expert astrologer. So go look at Pam Gregory's work if you want to hear more about this. But what I can say is that the bulk of that shift from a lot of water and earth, which is what those planets have been in, to air and fire, is gonna mean it's the overlap of all the things we care the most about. I think you and I, Darren, it's like I said, it's the cosmos, it's space, it's things from space, people, beings from space, it's technology, really, really lightning fast innovation, things that are just like come in to being, especially technologically, and then humanitarian network, the public mind coming online, and consciousness. So these things are all, it's like if you had to set the astrological stage for a lot of the topics we're interested in, this is it. And it's really just starting. So I would fully expect that we're going to be seeing a lot of flavoring change in these directions over the next few years.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because when you say, some people are going to roll their eyes at this, I would add one thing here is kind of a contextual piece, because when you think about the notion that we are transcending a notion like physicalism, and we're moving towards something like idealism, If that's the case, then actually what we perceive as the physical world would actually be a downstream effect of these kind of streams of consciousness. And therefore, what we see in physical reality would be more like an echoing or mirroring of what's happening in consciousness. So, in the same way that Bernardo Kastrup has said that what we see when we look at a brain, which according to physicalism causes consciousness, is actually just a correlation of what's happening at this mind level, ultimate mind, and that being kind of disassociated into these different perspectives that creates each of us. Astrology could work very much like that, that it's just another way that the patterning shows up. So it shows up in things that we think and have made the mistake of assuming are causal in our physical experience, but actually might be more correlational. And that could also apply with astrology. Does that sort of line up with the way you think about how it informs us about what's going on and perhaps even knowing what's going to happen?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, you and I have talked extensively about the design. I think of all this as a set of nested designs from the very, very micro to up to, our lives, up to you can find the design in patterns, you can find the design in society. And then I think the one that I'm most fascinated by and that we talk about a lot is the cosmic design of this moment. So that the idea that there is an unfolding of consciousness that we are the expression of, and that is templated. You can look at a map of it in a way. You can look at sort of the architecture a bit of the architecture through astrology and there's other ways to access it is very in alignment with that idea. And I think it's extraordinarily true. It's not that every moment and everything is scripted. It's not like that, but that we're all linked together in a fabric that flows as one unit in a way that has mathematical properties, geometric properties, makes perfect sense. And that we would be able to see some of the pieces of that through things like astrology also makes perfect sense. And not only does it make perfect sense, but there's a lot of empirical support for it. I know a lot of scientists are probably like losing their mind right now. So please don't attack me. You'd have to really dig in. And I have tremendous respect for astrologers. I learned over the years how complex it is. And it's like a lifetime of learning, and it's fascinating. And I'm pretty convinced, especially with AI, AI is probably going to help us understand how it works and why it works so well.
Indeed, when I was thinking about what you were saying there, it reminded me of what we discussed on liminal frames, where one of the notions that makes people wonder if this perhaps is a simulation or a construct, a secondary construct, is the mathematical patterning you can do of reality, that there seems to be a way to model reality with math. And in a way, astrology is kind of more of that kind of same thing. And again, I would just ask people, if you really are moving beyond physicalism and moving more into a model like dual aspect monism or idealism, then it takes a while to really think about the implications of that. But one of the things we've talked about in this podcast and other podcasts as well is that time is not linear. It just seems that way in our usual default kind of setting. And on top of that, it's been demonstrated that people very often have precognitive dreams. This is going to tie into some of the psi aspects and consciousness aspects we're going to talk about with telepathy a little bit later. But because of that, we know that people do have notions of the future that are accurate, right? Even Dean Radin recently did an experiment that was trying to tease this out. And very interestingly, he argued that what he seems to say the data points towards is that what we perceive is the probable future, perhaps a possible future, not necessarily the only future. So that speaks to your notion there about free will. And there's still some malleability there, even though some of the main landmarks may be set ahead of time, right? And this also expands into how we are agents of our own life script, basically. So it's not like it's being done to us by some outside party. We, in a more eclipsed version of ourselves, were part of this process too. But yeah, I think we just need to be aware that we already understand time is not linear. It just seems that way to us in our usual default setting. And we know that people do actually perceive the future. So the fact that this patterning will also show up through astrological charts and whatnot should not be surprising to us, actually. And I'll just say from my own kind of anecdotal data here that when I gave you my information and you gave me my chart, a very, very specific chart, it was remarkably accurate. So I would just add that some people, when they think about astrology, they think about sort of like your Sunday horoscope they might have read in the newspaper or on an online website. And those are super vague and broad, right? But what we're talking about is very, very precise patterning. And these patterns, kind of like the fractal nature of reality, kind of like the recursive nature of reality, kind of like There's things we see in other aspects of nature, like in liminal frames, we talked about how a human lung looks so much like a leaf in terms of the actual patterning. So it makes sense to me that at the largest level, we'd also be able to see the same sort of patterning showing up in these other ways. Something else I wanted to bring up in light of some of the things we're talking about here, things we're tracking, is that very interestingly, I recently saw an interview with Salvatore Pais, who within ufology is kind of famously known for this guy who apparently patented what looked like kind of NHI tech. It looked like a flying saucer kind of thing. And that made people wonder if perhaps this is either US tech after all, these things people are seeing, or that they have successfully reverse engineered it, even to the point where someone is actually patenting this kind of technology. So we're used to hearing about him in those technological circles, but he was recently on a podcast talking about the sense, just like we talk about in this podcast, in terms of a convergence, that humanity is about to go through something massive and that it's coming in the near future, not the distant future. And that he was hoping that some of the technology he's been involved in creating would help us make that transit. And he talked about things like these cyclical cataclysms that happened every 12,000 years or so might be part of this. He talked about an asteroid that's coming. He also talked about a pole flip, which is one of the data points we've been tracking. So it's just very interesting for me to hear yet another source from a different circle talking about these same kind of notions. So what do you think of when you hear that happening yet again?
The other signal you and I track together have been for years, but that is definitely picking up right now is just that the experiencer data, like the number of people in I'm going to say our world, because I know we have some overlapping kinds of people and actual people, but in the world too, who are so clear that we are on the precipice, like not even like now, right now, today, maybe even in it with the drone activity of whatever we've been expecting. And we'll talk about that a little bit with the other world tapes too, because that's part of what the information they got. There's something massive coming. It has a lot to do with human consciousness. It's the next big up level. All the signals are there in sort of astrology, for example, and other places. The number of people that have been having a deep visceral sense of that with using the same language, the same time frames, the same intensity of emotion is off the charts right now. Dreams, lots of people having major dreams. And there's a lot of variation in the details, but there's no variation in the meta communication, which is it's here. There's a massive it, and it has something to do with consciousness and shift of human consciousness that's coupled with planetary, solar, geopolitical changes. And it's going to be, a bit upsetting because that's kind of the nature of birth and massive change. So there's it's here, and we should all be relaxing into it as best we can, because here we go down the birth canal is really off the charts. And in alignment with that, there's been so much more coming out of the public, right? So like when the telepathy tapes came out and everybody's like, oh my God, and it wasn't even related to UAP. It's not even coming through a consciousness community conversation. And then, the other world podcasts that you passed along recently to me. And then even I think of people like Annika and Tristan, who are, multiple souls in one body and in very articulate and clearly not dissociated in any standard way. Things like that seem to be increasing in the field. I mean, like they're just popping up independently of each other, but they're very similarly themed, and they point to some pretty interesting, distinct truths, potentially new or facets of reality that I know we've talked about and people have entertained, but that are actually starting to converge with some hardcore empirical data. So do you want to pop us up into the telepathy tapes?
Yes, and just as we do that, I want to read one comment that someone wrote to me just last night, which speaks to exactly what you were talking about there. They said, quote, "You have a better sense than me as to what's going on, but something is happening. I've been on a knife edge for a while, had odd dreams every night for the past couple of months, never had that happen before, either in frequency or content." So this comes my way all the time. I know it's the case for you as well. Many, many sensing circles, some having some overlap with ufology, some having no overlap with ufology, but it is definitely a dominant notion that's coming up over and over again. All right, yeah, so like you said, one of the interesting things to watch is that as we track these different data points, sometimes we get these really interesting surprises. And obviously, psi is something you and I both track because we are so interested in consciousness and we believe that human potential is so vast. But even though there's been psychological and even parapsychological experiments and data that's been around for 150 years that's pretty compelling, sometimes there's something that happens in the public sphere, sort of the populist sphere. So recently, we've seen this podcast arise called the Telepathy tapes, which has kind of caught fire. Everybody I know is talking about it. Everybody I know is sending it to their parents, to their loved ones, to their cousins, to their friends, people that they think might not be open to this, but they think are going to find it really compelling based on the nature of the data and how it's presented. And we'll also get into the Other World podcast and the 2 episodes there called The Reader, which very much dovetail with this. Again, feels very synchronistically orchestrated because I don't think the person who put together those podcasts and when they were preparing them had any idea that this would happen at the same time as the telepathy tapes. But let's begin with this question really quickly. Why do the Telepathy Tapes podcast material resonate so deeply for so many people? And why does it impact people differently than, say, the statistically significant results from psi experiments by people like Dean Braid? What's your take on that?
Well, the last part of that question is easy to answer. I mean, we all know stats are great, and we all we all need them and want them. That's the first thing we ask is, well, how many people is this happening to? But they don't. We need stories. We're story-driven creatures, and they speak to us very, very deeply. There's been a lot of research, for example, on how science is or isn't used in policymaking, and it's hysterical because it's really not used very strongly. What really goes into a lot of the policies that get made for us are human stories, and it can be a story at the right time for one policymaker that will push them, it'll motivate them to push through a whole suite of policy changes or new, where you can have very compelling stats with no story that will do nothing. So I think that's part of the reason it's having an impact. If you listen, for those of you who haven't listened to the telepathy tapes, please do. You will. It's wonderful, mind-blowingly wonderful in many ways. And it's important that we understand, especially for the autistic community, especially the non-speaking and low-verbal autistic community that has been assumed to, quote, not be there. They're very there. I mean, I think that we need to know as a society so that we can correct the wrongs that have been perpetrated on a community based on our assumptions. So there's just humanitarian reasons to do it. But in terms of its implications for telepathy, I think it resonates probably especially now because so many of us are being activated. I mean, so many people, even people who aren't typically interested in this kind of thing, naturally drawn to it, are having synchronistic weird experiences. They've noticed an uptick over the last couple of years in particular, probably. They've started to have their own prescient moments or their own forecasting dreams and things. I have heard a number of people in my life who are not minded the way I have, who've started to speak about that way. So I think it strikes a chord. It's kind of the right set of messages at the right time. And then the other thing that reason I think it resonates so deeply is because the way it's presented, and kudos to Kai, who put this together as the host. Wow, what an amazing job that they did in the production of this, because it so beautifully traces actual experiments that you as a listener, and you can go on to their website and look at the actual, where the camera angles were when they were doing all these things that they talk about in the first few episodes in particular. It's impossible not to note that it's the design, the study design is really solid. It's solid, and you're witnessing telepathy happening. What about you? What do you think?
Well, one thing I think is that, as I've been saying in my classes and I often say on the podcasts, that I find that in this situation, every question has its answer in the field. It's already there. We just need to be able to find it. And so I think a show like this and the revolution it's creating, I think that's not too much of an exaggeration to describe here, is it's providing us with insights and hope that we sorely need in this time. So a lot of people that follow this podcast recognize all the daunting challenges we're facing that are all spiraling up together, and they have a hard time seeing how we're going to get out of here alive, quote unquote. And, we'll see what happens with that. We've talked before about this seeming like a transition to something that, even though it will get pretty intense, there is another side where things seem much more promising. But this is one of the things that can carry us through, because if we realize that we're more than we thought we were, and that life is more than we thought it was, then suddenly we realize we have more resources than we thought we had to draw upon. So we might not be as doomed to one particular outcome as it might seem the case if you just look at things on the surface level. So I think that's something else that is really compelling. I think the last thing I want to say too about why this resonates with people is because of the human stories. These are parents with children. People have either been a child or a parent or both, and they know what it feels like to feel marginalized. They know how much love there is and how much there is a desire to see these people grow into fruition and become who they have the potential to be, and to know that there's been this entire community that's been marginalized, and that these parents were actually told, like you pointed to, that there's nothing really there. There's no light on. There's basically a vegetable before you. We find not only is that not the case, but they actually are tapping to levels of reality that we have not even barely begun to deal with on sort of the mainstream level. So I think that's also really compelling because it's such a heartfelt kind of story over and over again, multiple stories with different parents and different children. But I think everyone can relate to it. And that's partly why it's not cold and calculated, kind of like a lab experiment would be. So that takes us to our next question, which I wanted to get to because these shows are about a lot more than just telepathy. And yes, to the point Janis made, it's the Otherworld podcast that has 2 episodes called The Reader, which again, very synchronistically, interestingly, follows the situation where this one woman became the teaching assistant to a child who was nonverbal, I think in the 1990s in Georgia, and had a very, very similar experience. And this is run in parallel, but 2 different experiments, 2 different stories. People are not connected to each other. But this is the question. Both the telepathy tapes and the reader episodes on the Otherworld podcast tell us about more than just the reality of telepathy, as significant as that is. What else stands out to us in terms of what these experiences reveal about the underlying nature of reality?
Okay. Well, I think, they confirmed to me that a lot of the non-dual assumptions and, some of the more philosophical, I mean, I really came at this through spiritual teachings, and particularly non-duality and indigenous teachings. But I know, there are, we have people out there like Castrop and a lot of other physicist types who are also, and philosophers who also have theories of realism and materialism and stuff. So there's a lot of languages for the same thing, and then there's a channeled material like the law of one and the raw material. So those all converge. It's like this is the empirical analog to those theories or those explanations of, of life and reality. So I feel like, and part of what they're pointing to is all the things we've been talking about. We do not die. There is a before, there is an after. There are multiple dimensions. There's communication across dimensions, even when you don't think it's happening. It's happening in your dreams. It may be happening when you're driving down the road, because you are an energy being that can receive information and give information to the field. I think the telepathy example is a particularly powerful example in these podcasts, because you can see it happening. Like, as you listen, if you haven't listened, you will, like, you can hear it, see it happening. And then when the young people, the autists, go on to talk about what's happening on the hill, which is where they all meet telepathically, and I'm dying to know why it's called on the hill if there's a visual of a hill. Like, but when they meet on the hill to exchange information with each other, as well as with what I think some in the spiritual community would call the Akashic records, or sort of the morphic field beyond here that contains all information available to all of us, I think it really signals the deeper truths of our nature. I love that you pointed to the hope, because I think we do need hope, but I think it's more than hope. It's like we are learning deeper truths about the nature of reality that we can access. So I think that's the other thing that it really speaks to me is this isn't a unique trait to one group of people. If anybody can do it, we can all do it. We all must have some of the wiring. And I suspect probably a lot of us are already doing it. So there's this amazing opportunity for us to begin learning to work with our own skills. And I love that the autist community that at least that is interviewed want us as the others, the non-autists, to understand and to know and to be able to access it ourselves. I heard several of them talk about that, and I just felt deep gratitude in my heart, especially given, gosh, you can imagine if they've been telepathic their entire life, they've heard probably a lot of really negative stuff about them and autism and their families, and yet they still, many of them still want to help us as a species grow. I'm really psyched about that. And the only other thing I want to add here is I was really struck by the amplification process. It really does seem like this call that a lot of sensitives are getting, that just like it's important not just that each one of us have our knowings, but that we connect with each other, that there's power, there's more potency in energetically linking up, that there's an amplification that happens. That seems like a very important message that is very easy to lose in our very individualistic world, where we only really think about ourselves. But I feel like I'm seeing that in our world, our consciousness related community. And I definitely saw that with the autistic community around the way that they work with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we practice in my classes. I call it a shared field of intention, where we set that in the very beginning in the first session and hold it throughout the weeks of the class. And I think everyone has felt the actual way that it impacts them. It's been very profound. So I totally agree with that. I want to touch on a few things that stood out to me. Some of them dovetail with what you talked about, because it is about much more than telepathy, and much more than telepathy where it's just a sharing of thoughts as if one word after another, kind of typical linear communication. It's really what I call total presence telepathy, where the full beingness of each other is available to each other. So it's much more profound than just a series of messages. For instance, as I pointed out in the Liminal Frames episode where we discussed this, there was one case where this one autistic child knew the plot of the Harry Potter books, and when his mom says, "That's weird, you didn't read those books," he clarifies, "No, but my sister did." So it's in the field, right? It's in the Akashic records now, as you would put it, and therefore he could access it. So that has profound implications for us. But it's about much more than just linear thought by thought, as if we were replacing language. And actually, this is one of the interesting ways that this stands out as being different, is that it actually challenges our understanding of what communication even is and what we actually have available to us in potential. Another key part, of course, is that it, like you said, tells us that we're not going to die because they have communication with the dead. So in the Otherworld podcast, in those 2 episodes called The Reader, kind of surprisingly one day, this child says to the person who's their assistant, "Someone's coming through right now. It's your dad who died in this boating accident in the past." And this is very interesting that it plays into what you were discussing earlier with channeling, because what she noticed when she looked at the child was that the child is using this thing to type out her responses, and suddenly her behavior was different, right? She was not making any spelling mistakes. She wasn't forgetting to press the space bar, which she would tend to do when it was her consciousness actually being in charge. And she also seemed to be looking off in the distance in a way that was different. So basically what it looked like to the person who was getting the message from the girl was that she was basically becoming a channel for the father. So she became the sort of go-through by which this message came. And actually, it's more like the father's consciousness was coming through the physiology of this autistic child. So again, that's fascinating, and that completely matches up with the raw material and the Seth material and all these great examples of channel material that we have from our past as well. So channeling absolutely is in there as well. Now, in terms of communicating with the dead, what's also fascinating when we think about sentience and consciousness in general is that this included pets as well as people. So this has major implications, not just for us who have beloved animals that we would like to see again, but even in terms of how we treat animals and how we treat other kinds of sentience, which of course dovetails with this overarching question in ufology about how will these beings treat us. Well, that should in turn make us think about how we treat the species that are on this planet already that are non-human, but maybe have been under our thumb, so to speak. So fascinating implications as we come to the end here. I want to turn it over to you for some final thoughts in a minute, but we would recommend both of these podcasts, the Telepathy tapes and on the Otherworld podcast, this 2-parter called The Reader. Both are incredibly compelling, incredibly heartfelt, and the implications are immense. And they're the implications that we need at this moment to successfully make this transit is what I would say. Any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, it just occurred to me that a test of sentience for AI may be whether or not they can be contacted in the field after they're decommissioned. Right? Once we get the science for that, then I think it adds an interesting potential layer for empiricism. Um, I also wanted to just say, in terms of telepathy, I think we have a lot to look forward to, and I loved that you pointed out it's not just like word to word. It really is when at least the way I experience when I'm sensing like that. I'm not fully telepathic by any stretch, but I can sense a lot, and you get a signature. So it's like when you're connecting with somebody and the energy connects. I think that's what empathy is. It's a merger of energy. Some of my essence mingles with some of theirs, and there's a lot of information in that, which I think has again implications for our hyper focus on privacy here. People are like, you're not going to be able to be as private because you can't control what sort of goes along in that bundle, because a lot of things are sensed that I remember one of my ex-partners used to tell me not to pay attention to a certain thing that he used to do that drove me crazy. And I was like, the second you show up, I can see it. I don't have a choice. It's just like a neon light there. It is a little bit interesting. But I think on the other side, what we have, in addition to a whole bunch of opportunities, is an opportunity for intimacy that I think humanity desperately needs. Intimacy with itself, intimacy with source, and intimacy with each other that is currently not available because of the way we conceptualize our boundaries and because of the ways that we keep from energetically merging, or we just don't know how to do it. So I'm pretty excited about that potential.
Well, just to dovetail with that, I would say that we know that the challenges we face are collective challenges. So the fact that this points to us responding as a collective, and the fact that we ultimately are a collective, that the boundaries between us are porous and we can actually interact with each other's consciousness. And like you say, actually look to some of the promise that holds rather than just the threats in terms of being concerned about our privacy. Because what we all deeply want is intimacy, is connection, is being seen, is being known. That's what's so compelling about these children's stories, is that they are finally being seen, finally being known. One of the interesting aspects is that because of this series, many, many people around the world are reaching out in the field to these kids and they're feeling it. So this really speaks to the opportunity here. And if we're going to make this transit successfully, we need to do it together, because the systems of the world, climate, and all these other things work as one collective. We need to respond with that kind of perspective. And these kinds of shows that are seeping into our consciousness help us make that transit. So that's going to do it for this particular edition of the podcast. We hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks' time for Event Horizon.